Shepherdstown this morning, and the Route 9 detour is annoying.
Yeah.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
Anderson will do it.
Ooh, we're live.
Yeah, that's we did it.
I know, it's always a huge accomplishment when we see that go on. It may or may not go out, but at least we're on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll assume that Mike is getting this posted up to the Mosby Heritage Area page.
Yeah, Andrea will share it to the Loudon Museum, and then we can get going.
Cool.
Take it away, Travis. You want,
Sure.
or should we make small talk for a little longer? I don't know.
We'll make small talk for another minute or so. Give people a chance to settle in.
Does anyone have a favorite, like, true fact about the Revolutionary War? I don't know what that would be, but like a fun thing that seems mythic but is actually true.
Oh man,
that's actually
we're all
my brain is fried from writing about
it's a challenge.
Let's spend the next 30 minutes
pondering.
We'll circle back around at the end, maybe.
Yeah.
We'll be circle back people. Let's circle back.
I am full of Revolutionary War facts, but I don't think our crowd really needs to be subjected to that tonight.
Why not?
This is a big moment.
I was about to say, roll with it, Travis.
And I know Stephanie is full of facts.
I'm full of facts. I'm full of anti-facts, so.
We all know what Anne-Marie is full of.
Fun?
Yeah.
Beer soon? I matched my beer today.
That came out meaner than I meant. I'm sorry. So. All right. Well, I think we're just about ready. So welcome everybody to tonight's edition of Historians on Tap. The topic tonight is founding falsehoods. We're going to take a look back at the Revolutionary War era. It's an incredibly important era in our nation's past, but it's an area that has been mythologized for generations. There's a lot of misconceptions, myths, a lot of facts going on. There are things that are purported to be fact that might not necessarily be true. Some things have their root in truth. So we're going to talk about that, kind of pick it apart, and find the truth kind of buried under all of this. And so tonight, as our special guest, we have Stephanie Seal. She is the digital liaison for the humanities at the University of Southern Mississippi. Excellent Revolutionary War historian, one of my best friends. So great to have you, Stephanie. Stephanie, what will you be talking about tonight, and what are you drinking?
So I'm not a beer person, which I know is strike number one against me, but I am a whiskey person. And this is Elijah Craig 18, because, go hard. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight, I am a Loyalist historian. I am at the tail end of my program at George Mason University, where I study Loyalists and loyalism in Revolutionary Virginia. And so I'm going to be talking about Loyalist and Patriot populations during the war, and how numbers don't mean anything depending on what year, what day you're talking about. So numbers mean jack. So
great. All right, Joe, what do you have on tap tonight?
Well, I wish I could have said numbers don't mean anything when I took the SATs and bombed them.
Numbers, the points are made up, right?
I did say that and bombed it. So
exactly. Yeah. Man, missed opportunity for me. I am going to, I'm drinking Crazy Pills by Solace Brewing here in Loudon, a really good Pilsner. And I think that the Boston Tea Party is a bit overrated. So I'm going to refocus onto...
Hot take.
Oh, man, the alarm. I'm slow today. Where's my alarm? Starts early today. And what I'm going to focus on, though, are years of anti-consumption agreements, particularly led by ordinary women in colonial America, that had a huge impact on the lead up to the war.
Cool. Anne-Marie, what are you drinking tonight?
So tonight I'm drinking Hardway Summer Lager from Old Ox. Old Ox is now open. Their Middleburg location is open for outside seating and drinking. It's really, really nice. And you can also, of course, pick up things to go. Tonight I'll be talking about Mary Ball Washington, who throughout history has had some aspersions cast on her, and so we'll be unpacking some of that.
Cool. Great. Well, tonight I am drinking Coast from Crooked Run Brewery right in Leesburg. And I'm going to be talking about kind of the myth of the militiaman and kind of the idea of the ordinary soldier during the war and how much of an impact they actually have on the war. So should be a lot of fun. We've got a great slate tonight. I believe we're going to start with Joe. So go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, and like you guys, when I was thinking of the Revolutionary Era, it's surprising how many falsehoods I came up with trying to figure out which to talk about. So I tried to find a topic that kind of touched maybe upon some of them, particularly in the lead up to the actual war. But to kind of just to give a precursor to some of the information about non-importation and tea that I want to get into, just a lead up to what's going on before the Revolution between the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. Where out of the 7 Years' War in 1763, British Parliament needs to find more money to pay off for that war. And for a lot of people in England, they look at the colonies and they're seeing what gets referred to as an empire of goods, where colonials have a lot of imported products, imported outfits, imported tea and things that they're consuming. And it makes British Parliament, and justifiably so, think that they can, pay their fair share to help pay for costs of the French and Indian War. And it's these goods then, though, that lead to issues that really start to break apart colonists who want to be viewed more as Englishmen, not as Americans, to then actually leading to the Revolution. And there's multiple passages passed and acts passed to try to tax them, and then there's protests surrounding those. But when the Townshend Acts passed in the latter part of the 1760s, one of the goods that's taxed on importations is tea. And it begins a broader non-importation agreement by colonists, where they're not going to import these goods as a way to protest the fact that they're being taxed. And tea especially is the one that angers a lot of American colonists, because it's become very much a social act drinking tea in the colonies. The colonies don't have a lot of things in agreement and similarities, but one thing they do have in common is that they are consuming the same goods, as they're all coming from Britain. And tea is a huge thing, particularly with women are huge consumers daily of tea. So attacking, and Anne Marie's still one of them. She doesn't know.
Apparently it's passe now.
I'm going to dump all the tea that's in the office like out the door one day these days.
Non-importation's still on. You got to protest a little bit longer. But when they start cutting back on consuming these products, that's hitting British Parliament, who have a lot of financial investments in things like the East India Tea Company. This is hitting them in their wallets. And what you see are increased boycotts. And we often think of the Boston Tea Party, again, of dumping tea into the harbor as being like this key moment, which brings on the coercive acts and really moves towards war. But that focuses on Boston Harbor specifically. And it's really a lot of the acts after that throughout all the colonies that's really hurting Britain financially and exacerbating these issues. Because out of that, consumption becomes a political act where they are making very public pacts with one another throughout towns and communities in the colonies about not consuming these goods, and tea becomes the key one. So they're writing their names on public forms and sheets and in newspapers and in pamphlets. They are all basically holding each other accountable that they're not going to consume a lot of these British goods to hit Britain economically. Now, who's buying a lot of the products for colonial households? It's really women. They are the ones that are taking care of clothing, goods. So if you're going to have an economic boycott, you've got to have women involved in it. So that then makes colonial men have to then bring them on board with this sort of economic act. And the act of boycott is novel. This idea of boycotting consumer goods is not like they can look back to a previous time and think, well, we're just going to do what they did. This is a very novel thing that begins to happen in the late 1760s, and then especially after the Tea Act in 1773, and even after the Boston Tea Party. So with this kind of public pact that they make, again, women have a crucial role to play in this, and men try to get them on board. And they come up with things like the good wife, that, they're willing to sacrifice for the common good, but not unsettle domestic norms. For women, though, they use this new political consciousness and their new act in society politically to try to make some domestic changes too. And there's some really interesting stories that I'd picked out about how women are aware of this and then start to use it for their advantage. But it's really common colonials who are taking part. For example, there's a 13-year-old girl who actually writes about these boycotts in her journal, saying, "I am a daughter of liberty. I choose to wear as much of our manufactory as possible." Again, showing that even children are feeling a part of this movement that's going on in this economic boycott. But in terms of using this for leverage, what you see colonial women talk about specifically is a bargaining chip with cutting back on heavy drinking by men, where they're saying, all right, we'll give up our consumption of tea, but you've got to then look at yourselves in terms of how much you're drinking. So for example, this goes throughout the northern colonies.
Cheers.
Here.
This goes on in New England. It goes on in the middle colonies here in Virginia, and even down into South Carolina. So they have some ladies in Newport, Rhode Island. They publicly make this basic bargain, really, with colonial men. They say, quote, "We are willing to give up our beloved tea for the good of the public, provided the gentlemen will give up their dearer and more beloved punch. Renounce so often going to taverns and become more kind and loving sweethearts and husbands."
Oh,
Well, that's sad.
Well, save the awes for a second, because they add a little jab in to men who get a little too drunk. They then say about intoxicated men in kind of a poem at the end of their writing, "Most gladly we set aside our tea would lay, could we more pleasures gain some other way." So they are taking a little jab at men who drink a little bit too much, and some of their acts are unable to act.
I like that.
You see others kind of similar acts. A woman in Massachusetts, also in terms of using this as a bargaining chip. She wrote, in response to a newspaper that called women the softer sex, she said, "I believe that there are a greater number of Tories of men than of the women kind. Pray, how many of our sex joined and denied ourselves of what was idle to us, tea? How did we withdraw from the shops of the importers and abhor them?" She continued to say, "I have thought there be many a set of men who may be styled the softer sex." So again, women are really using this to kind of take jabs at men for their heavy drinking, the ramifications of that, but also using this now for economic power. You also see this getting picked up in England, where women who are doing this are taking on some risks, this kind of new position of power. And if this doesn't work out, they serve to lose on this as well. And there's a cartoon I was going to show you that was done over in England who mocked colonial women. And it's particularly after word gets out about a meeting that happens in North Carolina. Let me try to share my screen here. Anne-Marie, enable me.
oh, sorry about that.
I won't do that, I promise.
I don't know, you might take advantage. All right, you are now officially a co-host. You should be able to share.
Oh, and also I've got a question. Remind me to come back to a good question about tea after this.
We'll circle back around.
Yeah, we'll be circle back, people.
Go back to it.
That was a great quote about the more Tories among the men. Like, that's phenomenal. I love that.
Yeah. So does this show in full screen the?
Yes, you're now
Yeah,
on.
there we go.
Dog
Yeah.
peeing. I love the dog always peeing in the
Yeah,
stuff.
there's
Always.
always
Oh, yeah.
a dog.
Classic.
Like from the engraving after the ride on King Street to everything, there's always a dog involved. And this one's front and center like usual. So this is a British cartoon done about a meeting that happened in North Carolina called a Society of Patriotic Ladies. And I mean, just look at this and you can see what they're trying to say about colonial women who are taking part in public acts of non-consumption. So what they're doing is publicly signing their names onto a list saying that they and others are going to hold each other responsible for not consuming tea and other products. So I mean, just look around. I mean, the lady who's sitting, I guess, facing us, she has got a man on her, doesn't seem to be fighting it.
Yeah.
Pretty baller.
Yeah, you see a
Like
lot
the
of,
lady directly behind her just chugging from the punch bowl, like, which kind of goes back to
Directly
what you
from the
mentioned about
bowl.
punch. Like, yeah.
yeah, they're doing the same thing that they were then criticizing men for doing. I mean, you look in the far left, pouring booze into a hat. Look at the child itself. What that is signifying is that these women, by taking on this public role, are failing as mothers and of keepers of the house.
Classic.
Yeah, this child is
like an African American woman back there, you know, maybe an enslaved woman back there.
An enslaved person waiting on these women who are failing as mothers and as wives. And I mean, look at that child. Where's the mother?
Where's your mother?
Think of the children.
Someone think of the children.
And the
the poor dog.
are very grotesque looking.
Yeah,
what's that, Stephanie?
I said the women who aren't being loose in that picture are very grotesque looking.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very manly looking. Like they've lost their feminine, you know.
Absolutely. And the dog is peeing in the house. So I mean, it's just chaos in this picture.
Yeah.
So again, that is really the risk that then women take by taking on this new active role. And you do see these acts, again, it's all throughout the colonies, where a lot of acts that people focus on are New England specific. This is going on in all the colonies. It happens here in Loudoun County, for example, too. In 1774, in July, for example, there is a rally on the courthouse to denounce what they call utterly repugnant to fundamental laws of justice, British Parliament acts. And they also form a committee of safety, which basically was meant to keep an eye on each other and make sure no one's violating this public pact of anti-consumption of British goods. So this is going on, again, multiple examples of it. But ultimately, when people think of the colonies, what's binding them together aren't some of these individual acts per se, but really these goods, where there's totally different colonies. They don't have much interaction with each other, but what they do have are the same goods in their households because they're getting them from the same source. And by kind of agreeing on these community pacts and it becoming a very continental wide thing, it is a huge act that brings people together. But they wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for who was really keeping the households and the buying power, which was common women in all of the 13 colonies.
Yeah, I really love a lot of the things you brought up here because it strikes at the heart of a lot of other kind of myths or misconceptions. You know, talking about consumerism, you know, these people are kind of viewed as consumers of these goods. So the best way to make their voices heard is to not consume or to destroy those goods in the case of the tea in Boston. You know, what is it? T.H. Breen's Marketplace of Revolution kind of really goes in depth. It's a phenomenal book about, you know, the shared identity of these people, whether you're in a city like Boston or Philadelphia, or if you're out on the frontier. People, there's a great passage by a guy named Alexander Hamilton, not the Hamilton that becomes famous. He's a doctor, and he's traveling out in the backcountry, in the frontier, and he's talking about cabins that have dirt floors and no furniture, but they're still drinking tea from India, sweetened with sugar from the West Indies, out of cups that were imported. You know, like, these kind of consumer goods bound everyone together. So it makes sense that that's how you're going to kind of make your voice heard. So I'm glad you kind of delved into that. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Kind of that myth of like the homespun, like we think of these frontier people or colonial people as like raising their own sheep and shearing the wool and spinning the wool and like making their, like, even out on the frontier, almost everything these people have is coming, you know, outside of food is being imported. You know,
ain't no one got time for that, even then.
Yeah, so that movement of making homespun and being like super proud of it is something that we see come out of this non-importation. And I think it kind of affects the way we look back at this time period, that like everyone made everything with their bare hands. You know, there's Age of Homespun is another great book that really delves into that phenomenon that these people were proud of, you know, making their own cloth or whatever, because it was a way to stick it to the British.
Yeah,
so.
and the book you brought up, T.H. Breen's The Marketplace and the Revolution. I mean, if I was going to pick, you know, a top few books that I would recommend anyone read about understanding the lead up to the revolution, it's that book. And he has a great anecdote that he tells too, I think in that book, or something else he wrote, about John Adams traveling back home, and he stops at someone's house in Massachusetts and stops there looking basically for some refreshments, and asked, I think it was like Mrs. Hudson, if she, who was keeping care of the house, if she had any tea that was brought in, not from England, but basically smuggled in and not paid a tax for, to get around that. And she's like, no, this is not a house that has any tea. Like, we're a coffee house now, basically, she says. And then he makes a comment out like he's so proud of that moment. But it's like, that's the woman who's really driving the hurt that they're feeling over in England, where it's not these speeches or these pamphlets that are being written. It's the everyday sacrifices that people are making, giving up things like tea, which are literally consumed every single day by a lot of people in the colonies.
Yeah.
And speaking of tea, we did have a good question about like the dumping of the tea and the East India Company from L, saying, wasn't the tea dumped by the colonists into the Boston Harbor owned by the East India Company and not actual British Crown? I believe that company wasn't nationalized until the mid-1800s. And she's right. And it's
a private corporation at that point. Yep.
Yeah, and
but they were given a monopoly by the British Empire, which is why they were furious over it. Because the tea that was coming in was actually a lot cheaper than the tea that they had been buying before. But since the British had created a monopoly, that's what the anger was over the India Trade Company.
Yeah,
right. And if I'm not mistaken, it was kind of consigned to merchants in the colonies. And there was like an incredible amount of pressure and like threats of violence on these merchants not to accept it.
Right.
And that's why it had been sitting in the harbor. I may be a Rebel War guy. I'm not a Boston Tea Party expert. I'll be the first to admit that. So
I was under the impression that the tea was so the tea was obviously the property of the company, but that it had already, at least in some part, been paid for by private merchants in town. Is that not true? Because
right,
I'm outside of the Rev War circuit. That's just one thing.
Yeah. I don't know if it's already been purchased, but the Tea Act passes in, was it the spring or summer of '73, giving, as Stephanie said, a monopoly on it, and it lowers the price of tea significantly so they can keep the tax on tea. But again, that's not really the point that colonists were frustrated with. So they basically don't allow the tea to come off the boats, because if it comes off the boats, then it becomes on the ground. Right. Yeah, it's owned by, she's right, it's owned by the East India Company, but a lot of members of British Parliament are investors in that company, which is why it's particularly galling to them, and why they then pass the coercive acts and try to.
And they gave it the monopoly because the company was about to go bankrupt. So this was a way to not only bail out and make sure those members of Parliament didn't lose their investment, but it also added another layer of control. So
and going bankrupt because these economic boycotts are having the effect.
Yeah, and smuggling, think about who these smugglers are, particularly in Boston. It's people like John Hancock, who are like being undercut by this British monopoly. So like, obviously there's a lot of gnashing of teeth from there. So
because a lot of my loyalists don't get it. They're like, why would you throw cheaper tea into the harbor? Like, what is it?
Like, we're saving money.
We're saying, like, John Randolph of Williamsburg writes this amazing pamphlet called Considerations on the Present State of Virginia. And one of the first things he lists is, please don't join this patriot movement. Why are they throwing cheap tea into the harbor? Like, this makes no sense. I don't get it.
And it really gets at the heart that, like, it's not that the colonists do not want to be taxed. Like, they understand the need for taxation to support public works and public things. The issue is they were not consulted. They're not being taxed by their assemblies. Virginia, this is done without consulting the House of Burgesses or, whoever. Obviously everybody wants like cheaper tea. Come on.
Obviously.
Anne-Marie is in favor.
I'm in favor of cheaper tea. I'm in favor of more expensive tea. I'm kind of an equal opportunity tea enthusiast. So, but actually, and
you need a T-shirt that says.
I need a T-shirt. So yeah, we could keep going. This could be the whole night. We could just switch it over. But one thing too that Joe's story brings up is something that I'm going to touch on too. And if we're ready, I'll kind of roll into it. Is this idea of Republican virtue, and national virtues, and how women either espouse that or they're dirty whores, just to put words out there. And so throughout history, not specific to the Revolutionary War, of course, but throughout history, there have been accusations that historians, or even just in popular memory, women get either painted as the Madonna or the whore, and this is something that we're pretty familiar with, whether you're in art history or, social history. And so the figure I'm talking about, Mary Ball Washington, falls into a different patriotic spin of that, where she's either painted as this perfect, holy Republican mother, or she's painted as this penny pinching shrew who is sometimes the bane of her son George Washington's existence. And so, of course, the woman behind this, we can only assume, is somewhere between these two extremes. But I thought we could kind of unpack what we do know, about Mary Ball Washington, and what that might say about her character, or what conclusions we can draw. So Mary Ball Washington was the only child of Colonel Joseph Ball and Mary Johnson Ball. Joseph had been married before, so she is the product of a second marriage, but she was the only child that the two of them had together. And by the time Mary is 11 years old, she's already an orphan. So her family is wealthy. She was born on an estate. She inherits land. She has money. She's still, upper class. But being a youth when she's orphaned, she ends up in the care of George Eskridge, who also oversaw her father's will. And so she was living in Lancaster. She was then living with George Eskridge. And it's when she's in her early 20s when she meets Augustine Washington. Now, what exactly Mary was doing between the ages of 11 and 22, we don't really know. As far as we know, Mary didn't leave behind a diary or letters of her own during that time. So a lot of her life is kind of blank spaces. There isn't even a good marker for when her birth was. Some sources say somewhere between 1707 and 1710, kind of. I think there's no hard date on that. Many historians put a 1709 date on her birth because at her marriage to Augustine Washington in 1730, let me do my math now, in 1733, she claims
numbers don't mean anything.
The numbers don't mean anything. It's all made up.
The points are made up.
The points are made up, and again, whatever. So it's 1731 that she marries Augustine Washington, and she claims to be 22 at that point. So judging by that number, she was born in 1709, but we don't really know. And at that point, Augustine Washington is already pretty well established. Similar to her own mother, Mary is a second wife, right? Jane Butler had died while Augustine was in England. And then when he returns, he discovers that he's single again. And so he marries Mary Ball, and they begin their own family together too. And of course, she has 6 children, 5 of whom survive into adulthood. George, of course, is the oldest, followed by Betty, Samuel, John Augustine, and Charles. Baby Mildred is the last, and she only lives for about a year. And the family moves around a few different times as Augustine is kind of building his miniature empire. He himself has a lot of land. He also has some different irons in the fire. Literally, he has, an ironworks that he's trying to get off the ground there north of the Rappahannock River. He also has the tract at Perry Farm where the family is going to live most of the time. That's, of course, George and his siblings are born there, and they have a happy little life. But then in 1743, Augustine dies, and so Mary finds herself a widow with multiple children to take care of, and not just multiple children, but an estate, lots of land. She has tenants that she's responsible for, and she's only 35 at this point. So she's a very eligible widow. She could have very easily parlayed, her little lifestyle into another comfortable marriage, but she chooses not to. And this is completely up to speculation what those reasons might have been. It's very possible that as a widow, she enjoyed having more independence than as a wife. She could own property in her own name, and she could govern the estate as her own self, and not give the rights to that property over to a new husband. In addition to that, it may have partially been about her own children and their inheritances as well, where if you're a woman and you get married again, even if your first husband had left certain properties to their children, the legal ramifications of getting remarried can get kind of jumbled up, and it's not super clear. For whatever reason, Mary decides not to get remarried, and so she does run the estate almost entirely by herself. She definitely has help. She is an enslaver, so they do have staff and workers there, but there are second and third party accounts of her actually going to collect rent. She'd get up on her horse at Ferry Farm and she'd go trucking around and she would go collecting the rent. And I'm not a landlord, but you can imagine you've got to be tough to go up to some of these tenant houses and be like, hey, you're due. I don't know if it helps her that she's a widow and she would kind of play that card, but I'm not gonna assume anything. She's able to make sure her children are educated, even if they don't have the funds to send the sons overseas to go to school. We know that George and the sons go to school, and we also know that Betty is receiving some kind of education inside the home as well, because they all end up as learned, functioning members of society. So it's at this point when her children are growing up. George was, of course, young when Augustine passed away, but as he is starting to enter the career world, this is when we see Mary enter the public sphere, influencing his decisions, for the first real tangible time as far as historians are concerned. And that's, of course, when George decides he wants to join the Royal Navy, right? Lawrence, his older half-brother, has said, hey, you can come join the Navy. Lawrence is, of course, really big about, that Commander Vernon guy,
Admiral Vernon.
the Admiral, who he names his house after. Whoa, it's a spoiler alert. So that's what Lawrence says is, come join the Navy with me. It'll be great. Mary's not sure. And so this is one of the first places that historians say she's being a jerk and she's not letting George Washington go join the Navy. But Mary didn't invent that the Navy was terrible at that time if you were entering in from the bottom rung. And so Mary actually asked her half-brother, Joseph Ball, what he thought about this. She was asking for advice, trusted Joseph Ball, and Joseph said, I think his words were, he would be treated worse than a slave and a dog if George was to go join the Navy. So based on that advice, Mary said, that's a no. That's a hard no for me, no for the Navy bit. And so there's a lot of flack that Mary catches for not letting her 14-year-old son go do this. But I think any other parent out there would agree you want the best job prospect possible. Mary was also careful to set George up for the most advantageous position that he could be in. George may have been Augustine's, couple rungs down in terms of birth order, but Mary always prized George as her firstborn. She was very dedicated to all of her children's success, but George, I think, bore a lot of that responsibility in being the firstborn, in being successful, and to, keeping the Washington name really pristine and prestigious. And in the long run, Mary was right, because shortly after that, George goes surveying and ends up coming it up with Lord Fairfax. So, as far as I'm concerned, no harm, no foul on that particular judgment. So I know, poor Mary, right? She
always gets a bad rap.
She does.
Vernon oversaw one of the worst British naval defeats of the entire century. There's this failed expedition in the Caribbean where literally tens of thousands of people died. Yellow fever just wipes them out. So probably a good call on Mom's part there. Yeah,
there you
I'm gonna side with her on this one.
That's a point. That's a point for Mary.
Mary.
Mom's call.
Mary.
Good call for Mom.
To all the mommies out there.
So to counterbalance that, right, because there's the other school of thought where Mary Washington was a saint and did no wrong, and George Washington is the holy embodiment of everything that his mother was, which is also reductionist and can't be true. Because we do know that she did cause him trouble sometimes, maybe whether she intended to or not. One of the first times is in 1755, when George is out in the wilds of then Virginia, now Pennsylvania. He's with Braddock, he's in the wilderness, he's doing whatever. Mary takes the time to write that she's out of butter, and if George could send her some butter, that would be great. If you would do that for me, son.
Reasonable.
I think we've all gotten those like calls from our parents where it's like, not now, Mom. Like, give me 5 minutes. And like,
I'm fighting the French, Mom.
right.
So there's this letter that George writes back, and like it's in George Washington language. So it's of course the utmost respect, you know, etc. Esteemed mother, you know, like, I apologize. I have no butter to send you, nor is there any butter in the environs here. You know, he starts like, there's no butter within like 70 miles of where I am, Mom. So that one I give as a point to like, okay, yeah, that was maybe unreasonable.
It's
but
so
that was
normal. Yeah.
It does seem kind of like a mom thing. Like we've been there. Like your house is on fire and she calls you and wants to talk about, you know, something else. And that's not the first time she does it either. So if we fast forward over time, Mary stays at Ferry Farm and she continues to run that situation. When George assumes majority and, you know, can inherit that property in his own right, he still like keeps Mary on. You know, Mary basically stays there. He's working, he's doing other things. So she's able to stay on at Ferry Farm. In 1772, he actually builds her a nice little house. You know, it starts off as a smaller house. He puts a nice addition onto it. It's only a couple blocks down from Betty's place. So she's right by her daughter. Charles has a spot, you know, a couple blocks down the other way in Fredericksburg. And so Mary is going to be set up very comfortably the 1770s when the Revolutionary War breaks out. And it's worth noting at this point, so in the 1770s, Mary's in her 60s or so. She's an older woman now. She is not riding as much anymore, which she is not very happy about, but she's still gardening. She still has a garden, both for food and for pleasure, in Fredericksburg. She's got a favorite spot that she walks to, like on her way up to Kenmore, where Betty lives. She's still active, but she is now, at this point, she's much more officially her son's ward, you know, for lack of a better term. He is legally responsible for his mother at this point. She is depending very much on her children that live in town, but it's kind of George's job a little bit. So when she writes to him during the Revolutionary War, that's something to keep in mind, because she's going to repeat her actions of 1755, but a few different times throughout the Revolutionary War to say, George, can you send me some firewood? George, can you send me some money so that I can get blank? And she at one point says in the middle of the war, I've never lived so poorly in my whole life. And poor George, of course, right now is also busy.
He's a little busy, right?
He's doing a thing. He's a little bit doing a thing. At one point, she even like petitions the colonial, the new Virginia government there, saying, can I get some food and some corn and stuff from you guys? Yeah, I think she's moved on from butter at this point, you know, but she's always asking for corn. She's always asking for firewood, and she's not wrong. There's a war. There are shortages. If Mary is saying that she's never lived this poorly or this frugally in her life, I'm inclined to believe her. You know, there's no reason why that may not be the case. But the government, gosh, I forget who exactly it was, but like kind of like pushes Mary's request off and like writes a note to George saying, hey, your mom's trying to hit us up for money. Can you deal with this? And he writes, you can feel the like embarrassment. He writes that like, she's fine. Like, don't listen to her. She's fine. And he specifically writes, there is not one of her children who would not split their last sixpence with her if she was in real danger. So there's kind of this understanding, like, she's okay. Don't listen to her. But I think there's kind of a medium ground there where I do think she was having a tough time during the war. You cannot get some materials. You cannot get some supplies. And also her other children. So Betty Washington Lewis, who's living up the street with her husband Fielding sunk basically all of the money they had into making munitions for the revolution. So that may not be an option if she's really feeling that hard up, right? She may not be able to go to Betty for some corn or some firewood. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So I don't know which point that goes to, except that it's kind of funny to see George Washington squirm when he's in like a socially awkward situation, because he is, again, he's very aware of, you know, propriety and honor and all of that. Absolutely. So Betty stays on in Fredericksburg, and we do know, of course, of the last time that George is purported to have visited his mother. That was in 1789, when he's like right before he goes up to New York to be inaugurated. And he makes time to go to Fredericksburg to see his mother. And this is one of those mythologized scenes, right? This is one of the few things that we have illustrations about from the life of Mary. You know, she had no portraits painted of her. We don't have any actual representations of her, but there are these beautiful scenes of an old lady laying her hand on George's head, and a former, you know, I think it's a cousin of George's, is with him on this visit. And later the cousin says, she said all these beautiful things. She said, George, go and live out your destiny and this beautiful thing that the country has won from you, and you've got my eternal blood. Like lots of things were apparently, allegedly said, but we can't say for sure, except to know that Mary did, in some capacity, give George her blessing. And this kind of harkens back to another myth about Mary, which was that she was a loyalist. And I'm sure Stephanie can unpack some of that later on. I know. So we don't know what Mary thought about the revolution, except that it really inhibited her ability to get things like corn and firewood. What we do know is that every single one of her children were patriots. So while Mary, you know, Mary being someone who was a very mature adult at the time of the revolution, maybe she was more sympathetic to the status quo and the system as it was. We don't know. Or maybe she was someone who saw the benefit of being an independent woman and what that would mean for the nation to have different rights, and maybe she was more of a patriot. We literally don't know. You know, it's all speculation as far as historians are concerned, until and unless other, you know, sources come to light. But at the very least, she blessed her son to go become the president of whatever this new nation would be, you know. So I think that at least hints to what she thought of or knew about what had happened in the revolution, of what it meant, that her children, multiple of her children, were taking leadership roles, you know, in the new country. And I guess my favorite piece of information about Mary is something that was actually said of her when the family was living together at Ferry Farm. And that was by cousin Lawrence Washington, who often visited the family, would stay summers with them. Travis is nodding, he might know this quote. And he said literally, I was more afraid of her than my own mother, being like, she may have ruled her family with an iron fist. He said, I was more afraid of her than my own mother, but she awed me in the midst of her kindness, for she was truly kind. And that's a direct quote about Mary, one of the few direct quotes actually telling us something about Mary and her personality. And in my mind, that is the fairest assessment of who this person might have been. You also look at the kind of person that we know her children were. You know, George is notorious for being a stickler for propriety and kind of a penny pincher, right? So it's not too far of a stretch to think that maybe those are traits that were influenced from his mother, you know, that were either inherited or taught, or, you know, somewhere in between that. And we can see that in a critical light, or we could see it in one that is, yeah, apples don't fall far from the tree kind of a thing. Cherries don't fall far from the, you know, coins don't fall far from the Potomac. And let's get some Parson Weems up in here. So that's kind of my takeaway. Mary passed away only a few months after her son was inaugurated. She died in August of 1789. She had been suffering for a long time from breast cancer. And so she passed away relatively peacefully and was buried up at Meditation Rock, which is a place that she would often go to. And again, a lot of people said she prayed every day for the revolution. We don't know, but she did like to go up there and meditate and have her thoughts to herself, whatever they were. It's interesting that in 1833, they started to erect a monument to her there at Meditation Rock, but the project kind of fell by the wayside until, you know, the very end of the 19th century, when finally, you know, an obelisk was erected there for her. So you can, I should give a caveat here that I did used to work for the Mary Washington House in Fredericksburg. So here's my little sales pitch. You can still visit the Mary Washington House in downtown Fredericksburg, where Mary lived from 1772 to 1789. Shout out to Ann Darren and the rest of the folks at the Washington Heritage Museums who oversee that site. And they've been helping to spearhead more research about Mary and, you know, learning more about a woman who was, surprise, surprise, you know, neither a whore nor a Madonna, but a person, you know, maybe a complex, interesting person.
Well, I learned more about Mary from you than I learned when I worked at Mount Vernon. So thank you. That was fantastic.
I feel like a better person.
Marie.
I do. I feel like a better person for knowing more about Mary.
Yeah. She was an interest, and like it's so hard because you think about all of the individuals that we learn about in history versus the number of people who actually existed on this earth in history, you know? And so Mary is one of those interesting characters who she exists right on the cusp of being really well documented, you know, or at least more documented than, you know, than others. So it's hard not to paint her as a secondary character who is one-dimensional, right? George Washington, who we've made into who did all of these amazing things, but who we've made into this big, partially mythologized character, and then his mother, we want to paint as either being perfect.
Oh no, the storm's kicking in.
I was about to say,
So that's it. That's all I got. Did we have any questions coming in?
We didn't hear your last comment. I think this is, we all have like various thunderstorms around where we are cut out for a second, and like you're like take home point. It was like I'm gonna make a big point, and then you cut out. Yeah.
Oh God, she's starting like that.
no, come back.
Okay, I can see you guys.
You're back. You're good.
Okay,
You're
good,
back.
good. So there.
I just picture Mary Washington like moments before George like goes and like addresses the nation, being like, George, where's the corn?
George, the butter. I'm also I'm so curious too, because there are plenty of little quirks that we know about George, like how he would stand up. He'd get to mealtime 5 minutes early, you know, and if you didn't come in time, that's it. He's gonna sit down anyways. Like, I'm so curious if little like household rules like that were at all influenced by his upbringing, by his childhood, and we don't know.
Is the Mary Washington House in Fredericksburg, is that attached to the college, or is that like run as like its own nonprofit, or is it connected with some of the other sites there?
Correct. So the Mary Washington House is operated by Washington Heritage Museums, which also operates the Rising Sun Tavern, which was Charles's, you know, house for a while. Also the Hugh Mercer Apothecary Shop.
Shout out Third Virginia.
Yes.
to Travis's Third Virginia.
To the Third Virginia.
Yeah.
And they also own the St. James House, which is another historic house that is only open like a couple times a year for tours and things. So they're their own organization, but they manage, you know, several properties there. They work closely with the university for historic preservation and cool things like that, but they're their own nonprofit. Cool.
And Kenmore is a site as well, correct?
Kenmore is owned by the George Washington Foundation, which operates both Kenmore and Ferry Farm now. So that's a whole other, you know, pocket of really cool, you know, historians and organizations down there in Fredericksburg that are dedicated to not just the history in Fredericksburg, but also George Washington and his family, etc. Because I think most of the people here watching appreciate this, but there were more Washingtons than just George, you know, and like there's some cool stories attached to all of them.
I'm a big fan of Lawrence Washington.
It's pretty cool, dude.
No, I actually got the chance to visit Ferry Farm for the first time back in February and was really impressed with the site. They do a lot of really neat stuff there. So.
Yeah, and they're doing more too. Like there's some new projects underway as far as archaeology and reconstructing the original. Because those of you who don't know, the actual home that they lived in at Ferry Farm is no longer in existence. It's not here anymore. But they're looking at building a replica. Like here's the original foundation. They're going to build a replica like over here, so you can still see, you can experience both. As I think they're planning. Travis, correct me if I'm wrong. You've been there more recently.
Yeah, I believe so. When I was there, they were showing off some of the archaeological work they were doing. So very, very cool stuff.
So yeah, that's my sales pitch for Fredericksburg. That's my sales pitch for Mary Washington. You can also find out more about Washington's connection to our area through the Mosby Heritage Area website. So there's our plug in there that I'll just put into.
All right, Stephanie, give us the other perspective. We've heard a lot about patriots and non-importation and all that.
About my nasty loyalists. I always feel like
right.
I'm opening myself up for so much scrutiny. Although I've been studying loyalism in Virginia for almost 10 years now, and I still haven't gotten too many threats. So who knows? Who knows how that would go. However, one of the things that I wanted to discuss tonight about kind of founding myths is the idea of populations. How many loyalists versus how many patriots versus how many neutralists existed during the war. I know Mount Vernon, quite a few, like probably 2 or 3 years ago, came up with an updated number. I know because it went throughout like wildfire throughout Twitter of how many loyalists there were versus patriots. However, the most referred to statistic actually comes from Robert Calhoun, who is a loyalist historian. He's actually considered the father of my historiography because in the 1960s, when no one would touch the subject of loyalism, he was the person who decided, oh, hell no, we're going to talk about this. But even he, in the 1960s, came up with this really pitiful number for loyalists. He said it was between 15 and 20% loyalists in colonial America, about 40 to 45% patriot, and everyone else is neutralist. However, anytime we see statistics like that, I'm always just completely wowed how there's no asterisk that has like about 6 paragraphs long about, okay, how did you come to this conclusion? Now, let me tell you what, Mount Vernon and also Robert Calhoun, those are forces to be reckoned with. They're just not putting up silly statistics up for you. There was a lot of research that went behind it. However, there's not a ton of explanation that goes into it. I'm not here tonight to necessarily argue that there were more loyalists than patriots in the Revolution. I'm here to ask anyone who is watching to consider, what do you define as a patriot? What do you define as a loyalist? What do you define as a neutralist? And on what day, month, and year are you talking about in the American Revolution? Periodization is key, especially for a place like Virginia. I know Travis is laughing because he's like, it's so true.
This is like how we met. This is like the first conversation I think we ever had. So
Travis is one of my best friends, and I think we ate kebabs and talked about this at Moby Dick's and like just got really curious about it. So one of the reasons why we attribute such a small number to loyalists is based off of the Loyalist Claims Commission, which is almost before even the war ended. It officially starts after the Treaty of Paris. However, there are people who submit claims to the British and they're like, I just lost everything supporting you jokers. Like, I've lost all of my property, my home has burned, I was forcibly removed from my community. I'm now living somewhere in the middle of Nova Scotia and I have nothing, and I really feel like you guys owe me something for my loyalty. There's tons of stories that come from loyalists like this. Well, there's not in the grand scheme of claims commissions, and Travis will back me up on this one, it's not massive, especially from Virginia. There is a historical narrative that Virginia's loyalist population is so minute that it just really doesn't even deserve a study, which is what I've been working the last 7 years of my life on, because that's not true. And that's because out of Virginia, there are only 513 claims submitted by Virginians after the war. However, all but 6 of them are living outside of Virginia when they submit those claims. There's multiple reasons for that. One is who had access to actually submit these claims. One, you had to know there was a claims commission even going on to submit something. Two, there are tons of loyalists in the Virginia backcountry who do not submit claims because they don't have the resources to submit a claim. And in fact, there's multiple committees organized that say, if you do submit a claim, you're going to be in some real fucking trouble. Excuse me.
Whoa.
Sorry, guys.
Wow. Stephanie Seal is the one who finally did it.
I finally did it. Sorry. My mother is watching this and now she's very upset. But anyway, they're saying if you do this, we're going to go tar and feather you and we're going to kick you out further into the backcountry if we don't kill you. Also, you're looking at affluent Virginians who had some royalist leanings during the war that they're told the exact same thing. They're not allowed to become members of society again unless they wholly take this patriot stance. And now the reason why I say periodization is important is mostly because, so what time period are you talking about? Are we in the end of the 1760s? Are we post-Boston Massacre? Are we talking about the Tea Acts and the Coercive Acts, the Intolerable Acts? Are we talking about when the Declaration of Independence is written? It honestly depends on what time period is, what your large population of loyalists versus your large population of patriots. What does that look like? What's that going to be? Another thing about that is throughout the war, British occupation and American occupation have a lot to do with who comes out as a patriot versus who comes out a loyal. I know I saw just Travis. Valley Forge is probably the most famous narrative of this because you have in Philadelphia, the British Army is occupying at the time, and people who were once supplying the American Army are now trying to marry off their daughters to British officers. It's about opportunism. It's about how am I going to survive the best? And if you look at the motivations of loyalist versus patriot, a lot of time an occupying force has a lot to deal with it. At the end of 1780, beginning of 1781, when Cornwallis comes into Virginia, he actually expects there to be a much larger loyalist population to join him than what there is. However, it's still decently sizable. And you have to consider there was no occupying British force in all of Virginia for the entire war. So up until 1776, you actually do have a large vocal community of Virginia loyalists. And then as soon as Richard Henry Lee gets Lee's resolution, which is to declare independence at the Second Continental Congress, the Virginia Gazettes changed their mastheads from the London Company coat of arms to something that's a lot more patriot, white-tailed deer with a bear with the "don't tread on me" snake on it. And you have this assimilation of the patriot movement, and remaining loyalists have to go and almost to a closeted hiding if they're going to survive. And also if they're going to be able to remain active members of their community. That's when they kind of go into this neutral territory. And then by 1781, when Cornwallis comes through, the majority of the people who join him are in the cities that his army is actually coming through because they have the safety of the army. So when you're kind of looking at your numbers and your statistics, you can't prove anything. And also, one thing that Travis and I have talked about a lot is the ability to change your mind, not just with an occupying army. I have quite a few people who were considered patriots up until 1781 when Cornwallis came through. So obviously that's a motivation. But I also have a group of patriots who by 1779, when Jefferson signs an act saying, when he's governor of Virginia, he signs an act that says you can start confiscating all loyalist property. There's some people who identified as patriots up to that point who they see that as tyrannical. That goes against what the Declaration of Independence independence had been written to say. And they actually voiced their disgust over being able to seize Loyalist property, especially when there's no real trial to decide who a Loyalist is. So you can have local committees of safety just go and take anyone's property at this point. So there's lots of different types of motivation that goes into, are you a Loyalist now, or are you a Loyalist at the end of the war? And the numbers that we get are almost completely at the end of the war and who had access to submit a claim. So does that make sense? That's my famous line after I say anything. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
Does that make sense?
Does that make sense?
I mean, I think a lot of that reaches back to, people who study loyalists, we talk about active loyalism and passive loyalism. Like, what is, active loyalism? You're joining the British Army, you're actually like taking up arms, versus, someone who just doesn't support what, the Continental Congress is doing. You're not paying your taxes or whatever.
Right.
You get drafted and you don't show up. Like, does that make you loyalist? And that also opens the door to the whole question of Black loyalism, the experience of, formerly enslaved people who are given their freedom by the British. Are they ideologically loyalist? Probably not. I don't think they have any vested interest necessarily in the British Empire, at least at that point in time. Maybe later on they do, but it's more of an opportunism, I think. And they get left out of the conversation a lot.
They do. And my dissertation is about both Black and white loyalists, and they are kind of seen as opportunists. And you can definitely argue that for white loyalists too. I mean, look at Claypool's rebellion in the back country. They're frustrated.
I'll be talking on that later, so I'm glad you brought that up.
I'm not going to talk about
foreshadowing.
I'm going to get it wrong. But Claypool in the backcountry of Virginia drinks God Save the King into the king's health. And it's mostly because he's furious that they're coming in and raising taxes on the community, but also trying to take soldier-aged men to go join the Continental Army. And that's his way to, thrust his opinion upon, the Continentals who are coming in. And we don't know much about him before this moment. Was he actually a hardcore loyalist? He sure as heck disagrees when he goes to trial. He's like, I'm so sorry, that was real ignorant, please don't kill me, don't hang me. And he gets taken out of it. So you just never know. But one thing on the Black loyalists that's actually really interesting, Alan Taylor, when he published his book a few years ago called The Eternal Enemy, he has a very small, it doesn't even fill a page, but it talks about this very interesting conspiracy among the enslaved community that plantation owners had actually fought against this idea of mass emancipation. There's a rumor spread around among, especially in South Carolina, that the king and parliament had actually advocated for freeing all slaves in North America. And it spreads among these communities like wildfire. And Taylor actually argues that this helps contribute to when Lord Dunmore announces his November Proclamation, essentially freeing any slaves to join him, that some of them actually do ideologically run to the British because they have heard these rumors that Britain had threatened for over a decade to be a great emancipator. And so they do run not as just a way to get back at their plantation masters, but also as a way to join the British Army because they kind of believe that they have had their backs this whole time. So it's a really interesting, and of course that's not like for every enslaved community, but there's certainly some Black loyalists who are joining the army because they think that, Britain has always wanted their freedom.
I'm also curious about, I was just going to say, I'm also curious about, you already alluded to this point, the idea that affluent members of society are under a lot of social pressure to be like, oh no, I believed in liberty the whole time, I was always a patriot. But there are at least a couple of the more well-to-do, I think, who they just kind of fly under the radar and don't say anything publicly either way, and one good example of this I would think would be Lord Fairfax, who is still living in Virginia all through the Revolution and who keeps getting a free pass, by the Virginians. We're like, you're okay, even though he's literally a British peer living among them.
Yeah, and he also gets a pass because of his associations with Washington.
Yep.
Yeah, because he's Washington's BFF at this point, and Washington even is still corresponding and talking with Lord Fairfax. So Lord Fairfax is very protected during this time period. I mean, he's listed as a loyalist in the Loyalist claim. The whole Fairfax family actually files loyalist claims, and so he doesn't necessarily identify as a loyalist, but he sees destruction of his property under the guise of loyalism. So it really is an interesting situation. I mean, there's probably the most famous example was Rhys Isaac published his incredible book, Landon Carter's Uneasy Kingdom. There's so many plantation owners. Oh, gosh, if I have a son, I'm naming him Rhys. Like, I just love Rhys. But at the same time, like, you have this planter elite who they're not so sure they want to join this yeoman revolution, because the yeoman class is really what's pushing the revolution across the colonies, much less in Virginia. And they're very hesitant to go. And they are kind of, William Byrd III is also in that category too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good point.
He has sons on both sides.
He's got one son in the British Army and another son in the American Army, which that son, Otway, was actually in the British Navy and dumped his commission. So he's kind of torn and conflicted, but you have this really interesting planter class that they aren't so pro-revolution, and they kind of keep their mouths shut, but they do kind of speak out on behalf of the crown, especially William Byrd more than Landon Carter. But when Lord Dunmore announces his proclamation, it's all over. So if you were to talk about populations of loyalists, like October 1775, Virginia would look very different than November of 1775, because it really pushes this elite class, because their enslaved individuals are stealing their arms, they're stealing their weapons, and they're joining Lord Dunmore to actually fight against them. And that is the most terrifying prospect you could ever offer an elite Virginian.
Now, you've spoken a lot about kind of elite Virginians in this. I think one of the big myths of loyalism is that it is an elite movement. You know, it's these very like conservative, very wealthy, very like invested in the status quo kind of effete, you know, landowners and stuff that are loyalists. But, you know, loyalism certainly exists across all spectrums, doesn't it?
Oh gosh, yeah. Especially so Virginia is a really interesting story of loyalism versus patriotism, because it's very regional. How people identify and how they act on their loyalism. In the Virginia backcountry, especially post 1776. During 1776, when you announce independence, any loyalists you have in that area, whether they're yeomen or elite, they go quiet because they know what's best for them, especially with a Patriot takeover of Williamsburg. Norfolk has been burned by Patriots at this point. So that kind of goes away. And the backcountry is incredibly poor. This is your most diverse immigrant population into Virginia. You have a bunch of Welsh, German, Scots immigrants in the backcountry, and they're more frustrated with Williamsburg and later on Richmond. They've always seen this kind of pomp class of burgesses as legislating against them, and they have always thought that Virginia burgesses never even considered them as a part of Virginia, and they deeply resent that. So by Williamsburg kind of joining into this patriot movement, that really forces the backcountry to be like, no, I want nothing to do with this. I don't want nothing to do with you guys. And also, you know, since you do have a lot of folks who are kind of recent immigrants, they're going to be your first and second generation Virginians. They identify a lot more with the British Empire because they are kind of fresh from the empire, you know, minus, you know, your Germans. So they do kind of have the tendency to identify more. And especially when Americans come in and try to raise their taxes, take their property, and also take their young men to fight in the Continental Army, they don't appreciate it. They just see it as another overreach of basically Williamsburg or Richmond, depending on what point we're talking about.
You know, this is taking it out of Virginia, but there's this famous movement in North Carolina before the war, the Regulator Movement, where these, backcountry kind of settlers rise up against the royal government. Well, most of those regulators during the revolution, or at least a lot of their leadership, ends up being loyalists because their qualm is not with London, over the sea. Their qualm is with the planters that are controlling the colonial legislature, and Claypool's Rebellion is a great example in Virginia. A similar thing happens in the backcountry of Maryland. You have these, they're not mad, what's the phrase where like better one king 1,000 miles away than 1,000 kings 1 mile away is kind of the attitude.
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, whoever sits on the throne isn't the person who's necessarily meddling with their everyday existence.
Yeah, exactly. And so they 100% see because the colonial authority, especially in Williamsburg, every one of those burgesses was a planter and, rented land.
And a land speculator. They're these people who are trying to kick these people off of the land on the frontier because like they're not paying their rents or whatever.
Exactly. And so there really is kind of like a class dynamic there. So when you see your Virginians who are on the fence, your elite Virginians on the fence, join that patriot movement, there's a backlash in the backcountry. I mean, the backcountry before 1776, they're rarely in the conversation, about what's going. I mean, Augusta County pretty quick gets a committee of safety. Every county gets a committee of safety and they all, kind of sign to the patriot movement. But at the same time, you don't really have an opinion from these back counties. It's really after Norfolk burns and the Loyalist epicenter moves west.
Yeah. So Travis, I know that you're of course knowledgeable about Loyalists and some ones in Virginia, but like,
thank you.
But I forget though, what were you actually talking about Loyalists tonight? What's your?
No, I'm going to be talking about something completely different.
Okay, good.
That makes me sad. You can change your topic real fast. Just like
I mean, I couldn't have done a better job covering it than you already did, Stephanie. I mean,
no, friend, you're the best.
So, like after the war, are there much stats on the amount of loyalists who either voluntarily or just out of concern left Virginia or these colonies to go to England, basically to avoid the public
Canada, man?
Because of their. Can I answer this one, Stephanie?
Yeah, please do. I'll let you go for this.
So that's one actual way that we can measure loyalists fairly well is by the number of people who actually leave. Now, you said left to England. Very few go to England. And it's important to remember, most of these loyalists are not, like fresh off the boat. England is not home to them. They've been in America 4 or 5 generations. They are born and raised in America, their parents, grandparents, and so forth. The vast majority of loyalists will go to Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, was Upper Canada, Ontario now. And the latest research that I've seen really points at maybe 80 or 90,000 people. It's one of the,
wow.
Outside of the forced diaspora of enslaved Africans, it's the largest diaspora to come out of colonial America is the Loyalist diaspora. The greatest movement of people to come out of this era outside of the slave trade, which is really kind of remarkable when you think about it. And so much of Canada today really draws their nation building, their kind of foundational myth out of this Loyalist exodus. Large numbers will also go to the Caribbean, but really Canada becomes the place for these people. And as I said, it's close to 100,000 people. And that's, white loyalists, that's black loyalists. Some of these white loyalists who do flee will maintain their enslaved people. A lot of them will go to like the Bahamas or Jamaica. So it's not all voluntary necessarily.
So I don't know the answer to this, and I'm sorry if I'm putting, either of you guys on the spot, but what is the ballpark population of the colonies at the time? Like so 100,000 people, that sounds like a lot. So 2.5 million?
About 2.5 million. So like this is a pretty
sizable that's a big chunk.
It's a big chunk. And you're also considering these are just the people who left or were forced to leave. There are many folks in Virginia. Like I have a running spreadsheet of Virginians that I've identified as loyalists throughout the entire war. And I'm bumping up on 4,000, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you consider only 500 heads of household applied for a Loyalist claim, that's significant. And these are all people. You have to also, during the Revolution, very few county jail records exist after the Revolution. Many of them are gone, which that would have given us a lot more information on who was being accused of loyalism, who was tried for loyalism. A lot of those records, and like I also said, we were talking about yeomen farmers did not keep the type of records that we have from the elite. Who's the patriots in Virginia during the Revolution post 1776? The majority are going to be your big names that you've heard your entire life, the people who kept these types of records. So it really does dominate. But everybody's done a shout out so far. And if they haven't forsaken me for my word eater yet, they may be like, please don't promote me. But anyway, I would like to give a shout out to the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada. As Travis mentioned, probably the vast majority of loyalists who leave after the American Revolution and during the American Revolution, they do end up in Canada, in Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick mostly. And they're a fabulous organization. They're a genealogical society. I usually like to compare them to the DAR and SAR, but for Canada. And one of the myths that we have in America is we see loyalists as victims, but we also see them as losers. And in Canada, that is not the narrative that loyalists have at all. They're seen as heroes. They're seen almost the way we would recognize Jamestown and Plymouth, because they really create these societies, especially like there's a really interesting parallel with a harsh winter in New Brunswick where so many people die. And this organization has done a fantastic job of really trying to, transform the way people in the United States think of that loyalist narrative. And I really appreciate them. They also gave me an amazing scholarship. So plug there. If you're a student who wants to study loyalism, please look at your local UELAC chapter and see what they can do for you.
Well, cheers to that.
Yeah, cheers. Yeah. If they haven't forsaken me.
And I'm just going to give one more shout out. I don't know if he's watching, but Todd Braystead, phenomenal historian. I'm so proud to call him a friend of mine from New Jersey. He is like the person who has studied loyalism back when it was not cool. It was not a good subject to study. He runs a great site, Royal Provincial. Just Google that and you'll find it. Tremendous amount of information on all this stuff. One of the he's so free with information, so free with his research. He does a tremendous job. So just wanted to give him a shout out.
Exactly. Yeah, I've never met him personally, but I know my research would not be where it is without some of the things that he's published and put online and offered resources to. So he's one of those historians who I don't think his praises are never sung as loudly as here to Todd Braystead.
Well, I don't have a whole lot of time left. That was such a great conversation. I'm not going to fault you at all because I love talking about this stuff. But I wanted to talk about kind of one of America's foundational myths, and that's the idea of the militiamen. If you go to Lexington, Massachusetts, you're going to see a statue of the Minuteman, a guy who's left his plow behind, picked up his rifle, and kind of single-handedly won the Revolutionary War. And if we actually look at the role of the militia in the 18th century, if we look at the way that they behave during the war, the way that they're used during the war, what we find is that they play an integral role. I don't want to disparage that. They play an integral role in the success of the revolutionary movement, but maybe not necessarily in the way people think. This idea of the citizen soldier is such a powerful part of the American narrative. And it's very important for centuries even to today. But I think it's a very misunderstood narrative. And so I just wanted to talk about that briefly. But in order to talk about that, we really have to understand what a militia is in the 18th century. Nowadays, when we think of a militia, we think of just a bunch of people who share maybe a similar political belief, who get together, they arm themselves. That is not a militia in any sort of historical sense. The militia in the 18th century is an arm of the government. When they say well-regulated, it is regulated by the laws of the colony, or later on after the revolution, by the state. And this is a really important concept. You know, the militia exists because of this long-standing American and going back British fear of a standing army. There is a thought in British political thought that kind of gets transferred to the colonies, that if you have a standing professional army like France or like Prussia or like Austria or like Russia, then they can use that army to, you know, dictate to the citizens, to oppress the citizens. And that's, you know, you look at the British Army in the Revolution. The British Army is one of the smallest armies in Europe when the Revolution kicks off, and it's for this reason. British people do not trust this, and Americans take this idea to the next level. You know, almost every colony has a legally bound militia. Typically, it's you know, every man above a certain age, every free man, I should say. You know, enslaved people are excluded. There are exceptions to who can serve, but you're expected to show up with a weapon a few times a year, practice being a soldier, and then you would be called out in the case of an emergency. This is a really, as we're going to find out, it may prevent the government from oppressing the people, but when it comes to actually fighting a long-term war, an 8-year-long war, it's not going to necessarily be the best system.
It is, though, Travis, if you don't mind me interrupting, it is supposed to be a great way to meet ladies, though, right? Like in colonial accounts, like mustering the militia is like a town thing.
It's
and
a social, yeah, absolutely. Before the Revolution, this is a social thing. If they meet, like, you know, every few months, you know, you turn out, you march around a bit, then you have some drinks, maybe you, like, you know, show off your shooting prowess or whatever to impress the ladies. The wife and kids come along, they have fun, they hang out. Militias vary greatly in quality and discipline before the Revolution. If you look at New England on the verge of the Revolution, these guys have been radicalized. They have been preparing for this moment for years. They have been arming themselves to an extent that other militias have not been. If you look, one of the best sources we have on this, a lot of these militia roles show like who actually shows up with their weapons, because you get fined if you didn't show up or if you didn't show up with a weapon. In New England, the rate of people bringing weapons is like 90%. In Virginia, that number is going to be far, far lower. In some counties in the Tidewater or out on the frontier, you're looking at like 50, 60, 70%. Here in Loudoun County, actually, it's like low. It's like below 20% of people actually show up with weapons, which again speaks to the fact that Loudoun in 1770 is not the frontier. You know, it hasn't been the frontier for a generation or two. You know, these are established farmers. They're not hunting. They're not shooting, you know.
Well, it's interesting with Loudoun, not to interrupt you, but like Loudoun also is producing some of the most per county soldiers to the Continental Army.
Very good point. And I was going to touch on that in a little bit, but since you brought it up now, yeah, one of the things you see in Virginia is actually Virginia's trying to arm Continental regiments. And so what they will do is they will start buying weapons off of private citizens to arm them. They leave a lot of the weapons in the Tidewater because the British could come by Navy anytime and attack the Tidewater. They leave a lot of the weapons out on the frontier because they're under the threat of Native Americans. Here in the Piedmont, the threat is not as dire. So a lot of this area, the weapons get bought up. You know, Loudoun has the largest militia in Virginia during the Revolutionary War in terms of people. But in terms of actually arming them, it's pretty pathetic. There's a great firsthand quote from Nicholas Creswell, this British guy who's here in Leesburg. He writes in October of 1776, quote, "General muster of the county militia in town. About 600 men appeared underarmed with tobacco sticks." So these guys are literally marching around with like tobacco sticks, like garden stakes, essentially. You know, the Loudoun militia, and this is something that, you know, we'll see in other militias, gets called up several times during the war, but not necessarily for combat duty. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I really want to touch on. If you have soldiers that, and I'm not talking about the New Englanders who have been preparing for this for years. They formed the core of the Continental Army initially in 75 and 76. New Jersey, a place that has been basically plunged into civil war, their militia is going to perform just as well as any regular soldier just because of sheer experience. But as you get further and further away from British occupation, the reputation of these guys is really going to suffer. George Washington says, instead of calling forth their utmost efforts, they are dismayed, intractable, and impatient to return. The British, this is a quote from Otho Williams, a colonel in the Maryland line. The British threw the whole body of the militia into such a panic, they generally threw down their loaded arms in the field in the utmost consternation. Unlike the Continental Army, which is going to be a professional standing army, these guys are paid to serve for a certain number of years. Militia typically gets called up for a few weeks, maybe a few months. I had an ancestor in New Hampshire militia. He gets called up for like 3 weeks and doesn't really see a whole lot of action. These guys are not expected to bear the brunt of the army. And this is a hard lesson that Washington and other generals will learn by 1776, 1777. For the most part, these are not guys who are going to stand in line and go toe to toe with the British Army. And it's those sorts of troops that they need. So by the end of the Revolution, the Continental Congress and the Patriot leaders have done what they feared the most. They have created a professional standing army because that is what is needed to win the war. If we're going to beat the British, we need to fight the way the British fight. We need to beat them in battle. Now, as I said, I'm not going to disparage the militia because they play an incredibly important role in the success of the war. They might not be there on the front lines necessarily winning battles against the British. They do at Lexington and Concord because they outnumber the British like 2-1 by the end of the day. They just swarm them. You're going to see battles like that down in South Carolina, the Battle of Huck's Defeat, where they call it the day that reigned militia because so many of these guys come out of the woodwork and just overwhelm the British. You are going to see situations like what you see in New Jersey, the forage wars, where small British patrols are going to be overwhelmed by large numbers of militia. They're also going to be incredibly important when it comes to social control. While the British, while the Continentals are fighting the British, the militia is going to be the ones cracking down on Stephanie's loyalists. Claypole's rebellion, this rebellion against Continental authority that happens in the Virginia frontier, is put down by militia from Fauquier County, from Frederick County, from Berkeley County, who march out there and crack down on these loyalists. In the South, they're going to be patrolling the roads, preventing slave insurrections, preventing people from running off and joining the British Army. They are going to keep the interior of the American colonies functioning so that the Continental Army, with militia, is going to be able to maintain itself in the field. And I think that is really the most important contribution of the militia during the Revolution. They are going to fight and win plenty of battles. I don't want to make it come across. I mean, you look at battles like Kings Mountain and stuff where, especially in the South, Southern militia is going to fight Loyalist militias to the absolutely, it's a war to the knife. It is a war to the death for these people against their neighbors. They are going to play an important role, but not necessarily. I don't want people to walk away thinking that, every farmer in America just picked up a gun and walked off and beat the British.
And was a hero, yeah.
And was a hero. It took a contribution on multiple levels. The front line, you have the professional soldiers in the Continental Army, which, unlike the militia, are poor, they're landless, they're jobless. These are guys who are really represent the people who don't have a future in this society necessarily. They don't own their own shops and farms and things. They're fighting for a better future. They're fighting for that land bounty. They're fighting for decent pay. They're going to be the professionals. The militia is going to augment them either in battle by increasing their numbers, providing manpower, or most importantly, being back home, rounding up supplies, rounding up money, suppressing loyalists, suppressing slave insurrection. That is really I think, the legacy of the militia. Now, the legacy of the militia extends even further if we want to move forward in time. That fear of a standing army is going to haunt the American military establishment really until the Cold War. If you look at every single war that we get involved in from 1783 up to, like I said, the Cold War, you're going to see a standing army that is very small and very unprepared for the task before them. You look at the War of 1812, we're like, oh, we're just going to rely on a militia, it'll protect us from the British. And we suffer for many years because of that. When the Civil War begins, the standing army is minuscule. It's what, like, Joe, like 17,000 people, 16,000 men, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, we could go to a whole thing about the debate over standing armies and what to do to protect yourself, but avoid it. I mean, I'm sure you're about to get to it. I mean, before World War I, it's like 120,000 people. It's like nothing. Compared to
even World War II, you think about the millions of men who have to be drafted in order to support that war effort. And again, it plays out on the battlefield. The first few battles that the American army engages in the Second World War, you look at like the North Africa campaign, Kasserine Pass, like American troops kind of get the short end of that. And it takes a while for us to kind of figure out how we're going to prosecute this war and get these guys transitioned from civilian life to military life. And that is a tradition that really dates back to the Revolution, and to even before the Revolution. So
sure. So we do have a question, because we're running out of time. Like, we know, like,
yeah.
Loudon produced the most militia. Do we know which county in Virginia produced the most Continental soldiers?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
All I know is that it's the militia. I don't know about the Continental.
Yeah, I mean, most of the soldiers from this area who enter Continental service end up in the 3rd Virginia Regiment, which is one of the hardest fighting regiments of the war. Virginia is very, very interesting because basically the entire Virginia line gets captured in 1780 during the Siege of Charleston. And so Virginia is forced to kind of scramble and try to rebuild that almost from nothing. Virginia, like many states, will actually employ what's called a levy system where, militia service is compulsory. If you don't go when the militia tells you to go, like, you get fined, you get jail time, like there's penalty. It's kind of like the 18th century version of jury duty, I guess. It's
or national guard duty. Yeah,
the government forces you to do this. So what happens when a lot of these Continental regiments get depleted is they will actually pull levies from the militia. They'll basically draft men and say, cool, you're a Continental for 6 months or 9 months or 18 months or whatever. Virginia is going to rely on that, as are a lot of New Jersey relies on it pretty heavily. Other colonies will do the same. So as far as which county supplied the most, I couldn't tell you. I can tell you the Loudon militia gets called out to dig entrenchments at Yorktown, but they get there so late that they basically escort prisoners back. Loudon doesn't get called out for Claypool's rebellion, but like Fauquier does. Some of the surrounding counties did.
Yeah. I really so correct me if I'm misunderstanding the hypotheticals here. So you're living in Loudon, Fauquier, one of these Piedmont counties. The government comes along and offers to buy your gun, right, to supply the Continental Army. Then you join the militia, but you don't have your weapon. But then you get scooped up to be a Continental soldier, and they give you a gun, right? Like, and the odds of like getting your own gun back or getting paid to get your own gun back that they already paid you for in the first place, like, that's just a funny concept. I've never thought about that before.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. A lot of in certain cases, every colony maintains stores of weapons for the guys who show up without guns. If you go to Williamsburg, you see this funny looking building in the middle of town. That's the Public Magazine. That holds tons of muskets to issue to the people who do not have them. Yeah, sometimes those don't come back, which is a problem. A lot of colonies find out that things tend to walk when you issue them out. I know in the case of guys that are levied, you actually get extra pay if you bring your own gun, because that's one less thing that the government has to supply you with. So.
Well, I know we're about out of time. Are there any parting shots about falsehoods or any of that? Well, honestly, I have like so many I was gonna think of. Like Travis, you mentioned a point that's like, it's not even just revolution, but just in falsehoods. Like the idea of a standing army is so feared for so long. For the majority of American history, it's seen as the biggest threat to America. Mm-hmm. And I don't think people realize that goes well into the 20th century.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something I briefly, I could give a whole thing on misconceptions of the British Army. You know, we always hear this thing about the British are the biggest army or the best army in the world during the Revolution. The British Standing Army, when the Revolution starts, is like 16 or 17. It's like about the same size as the American Army when the Civil War starts. You know, it's like 16,000 men, which, you know, the French have a standing army of like 200,000 men. Like, it is not even close. And even in Europe, it's a professional army. It's an exceptionally good army, but it is tiny. You know, you don't need a huge army when you're an island. You can have a huge navy. And, you know, there's a great quote, Elbridge Gerry, who's a member of the Continental Congress and, you know, big mover and shaker, the Constitutional Convention. I'm gonna butcher the exact quote, but he actually makes this kind of lewd comment where, like, he's like, basically a standing army is like having this is not what he says, but a member, you know, a large member. He's like, it ensures domestic tranquility, but it also invites foreign adventures or something along those lines, where, like, basically having a big army is a good way to get in trouble overseas.
Quote. I like that.
Yeah. It's a great quote, but that's really how it's viewed for most of American history. That's why, you know, when we talk about the armed forces, a lot of the founders had after the Revolution had a big push towards the Navy. They're like, the Navy can protect American interests overseas, but it can't be used against American citizens as opposed to an army.
Is that I'm gonna make a bad pun here that I'm not actually gonna say because it's a little naughty, but isn't that what Roosevelt said, is to speak softly but carry a big
a big standing army,
a big standing army? Isn't that what he said?
Yep.
Any questions? I know we've really gone on.
The last one we've got in was about the amount of Continental, particularly for Virginia. So we got all the questions.
Yeah.
Well, I
will
learned
not
a lot.
claim to be an expert, so yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot more we can cover. We kind of just barely scratched the surface on this. We'll have to revisit Revolutionary America again.
Yeah, and again, we take requests. So if we got like halfway down a topic that you guys want to know more about, you know, leave it in the comments, and we'd love to, you know, explore more. This whole program is kind of about rabbit holes. You know, some we intend to go down, and others that, you know, that come up as we go. So let us know if something sparks your interest. We're here to talk about what you want to know.
And we'll be doing this, you know, every Thursday in June. You know, and then we're gonna see what people want to hear after that too, and what we can do, and hopefully start doing a hybrid or even get back to doing these in person as well. But anything going on tomorrow with the Mosby Heritage Area?
Yes, we are doing our Live at 5 program, 5 p.m. I will be talking with Dr. George Oberle and Dr. Cynthia Kerner, both of George Mason University. Yes, Stephanie is clapping.
It's my advice.
I got to thank you for the hookup on that one. They have done a tremendous amount of research into the Mason family manuscripts there, and specifically with the Masons who lived in Loudoun County at Selma and Raspberry Plain, and kind of reconstructing what Loudoun County looked like in the years after the Revolutionary War based on these records. So it should be a really fascinating conversation.
Awesome.
Cool.
Phenomenal research, guys. I can vouch for it just because I was there when they were doing a lot of it, and the stuff that they've been able to dig up on Thompson Mason, who's the Mason not many people talk about, especially since he represents Loudoun. I mean, yeah, tune into that. That's going to be awesome.
It's going to be some juicy stuff, I'm sure.
Oh, yeah. If you want some juicy 18th century gossip, that's going to be a good one.
Well, what about you guys, Joe, at Loudoun Museum?
Yeah, so tomorrow we've got our next blog posting, and if you're interested in historic photographs and how to preserve those in your own home, you know, this blog's for you, and we're going to look at some then and now photos of Purcellville.
Very cool. Stephanie, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure having you on tonight.
I miss Loudon so much. So this was actually very nice for me to get to see you guys and to talk about some of my history. So people in Mississippi don't care about my Virginia Loyalists as much. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay, well,
Right.
we can sign
All
off.
right.
Yeah, we'll sign off with a toast.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good
Happy
See you guys
Thursday.
next Thursday.